What if the truth you've spent your whole life defending isn't even yours? On the day Captain Jacob Williams walked into the courtroom, he knew his fate hung by a thread. But a secret he never suspected was already waiting in the wings, ready to change everything. The early morning in a small American town in the southern part of the country began quietly. The sun barely pierced through the thick clouds, casting faint shadows onto the asphalt below. Jacob Williams stood at the window of his modest apartment, gazing out at the empty street. His tall frame, clad in a military uniform, appeared motionless, almost like a statue, but his eyes burned with a fire that betrayed the tension simmering within him. This was the day he had been waiting for over months. The day of the trial. The early morning in a small American town in the southern part of the country began quietly. The sun barely pierced through the thick clouds, casting faint shadows onto the asphalt below. Jacob Williams stood at the window of his modest apartment, gazing out at the empty street. His tall frame, clad in a military uniform, appeared motionless, almost like a statue, but his eyes burned with a fire that betrayed the tension simmering within him. This was the day he had been waiting for over months, the day of the trial. Jacob ran a hand over his closely cropped hair, feeling a slight tremor in his fingers. He knew he wasn't guilty, but he also understood that truth in this town rarely surfaced without a fight. On the kitchen table lay a stack of documents, certificates, letters, and excerpts from military archives. He had gathered these over the past few weeks to prove his innocence. His attorney, a young and somewhat uncertain Edward Lewis, had promised to do everything in his power, but Jacob realized the outcome of the case would hinge not just on the facts, but on how the jury perceived them. He glanced at the clock. Less than 2 hours remained until the hearing began. It was time to get ready. The streets of the town gradually came to life. Passers-by hurried about their business, paying little attention to the man in the military uniform walking toward the courthouse. Jacob felt the occasional stares. Some looked at him with curiosity, others with suspicion. He had grown accustomed to such attention over his years of service, but today, each glance seemed to carry a heavier weight than usual. The courthouse loomed over the main square, a massive structure with towering columns and a faded flag hanging above the entrance. Jacob paused at the steps, took a deep breath, and stepped inside. The air inside the courthouse smelled faintly of polished wood and old paper. The corridor stretched out before him, lined with framed portraits of stern-looking judges from decades past. His boots echoed softly against the hardwood floor as he made his way toward the courtroom. He passed a few people lingering near the entrance, reporters adjusting their notepads, townsfolk whispering among themselves, and a security guard leaning lazily against the wall. Jacob kept his posture straight, his shoulders squared, as if the uniform itself demanded it. He had worn it deliberately today, a silent testament to the life he had built. A life now under threat. Outside, the clouds shifted slightly, allowing a thin beam of sunlight to spill across the town square. It glinted off the windows of the courthouse, briefly illuminating the worn stone steps Jacob had just climbed. The town beyond the square remained unremarkable. Rows of brick buildings, a diner with a flickering neon sign, and a gas station at the edge of the street. Life continued as it always had, indifferent to the storm brewing within the walls of the courthouse. Jacob had lived here long enough to know its rhythms, its quiet days and restless nights. But today felt different. Today, the town seemed to hold its breath. Inside his apartment earlier that morning, Jacob had stood over the sink, splashing cold water on his face before dressing. The mirror reflected a man hardened by years of discipline, with faint lines etched around his eyes from sleepless nights spent preparing for this moment. He had buttoned his uniform with care, each movement precise, as if the ritual could steady his nerves. The documents on the table had been his lifeline, each page a piece of evidence painstakingly collected to counter the accusations leveled against him. He had read them over and over until the words blurred together, committing every detail to memory. As he walked through the town, the weight of those papers lingered in his mind. They were tucked into a leather folder he carried under his arm, a shield against the uncertainty ahead. The streets he passed were familiar. Past the barbershop where he got his hair trimmed every 2 weeks, past the park where children chased each other around rusting playground equipment, past the old oak tree that marked the turn toward the courthouse. These were the landmarks of his life, yet today they felt distant, as if he were seeing them through a stranger's eyes. The courthouse doors had creaked slightly as he pushed them open, the sound swallowed by the hum of activity inside. He stepped into the lobby, where the air buzzed with muted anticipation. A clerk shuffled papers behind a desk, her glasses perched low on her nose as she barely glanced up at him. A janitor swept the floor in slow, methodical strokes, the broom scraping softly against the tiles. Jacob moved past them, his focus narrowing to the courtroom ahead. He knew what awaited him there: an officer's testimony, a jury's judgment, and a fight for the truth he had spent his life upholding. The morning light filtering through the courthouse windows grew stronger as he approached the courtroom doors. He paused again, his hand resting on the handle, feeling the cool metal against his palm. Beyond those doors lay a battle he couldn't avoid, one that would test not just his resolve but the very fabric of who he was. Jacob exhaled slowly, steadying himself, then pushed the door open and stepped into the room where his fate would be decided. The chapter of that morning closed behind him, but the day had only just begun. The courtroom buzzed with the low hum of anticipation as Jacob settled into his seat beside Edward, who fidgeted with a stack of papers, his fingers trembling slightly as he shuffled them. The wooden benches groaned under the weight of the gathered crowd. Journalists scribbling notes, townsfolk craning their necks for a better view, and a handful of officers in crisp uniforms standing near the back. Judge Henry Collins entered the room, his steps slow and deliberate, his face etched with the weariness of years spent behind the bench. His silver hair caught the light from the chandeliers overhead, giving him an almost ghostly appearance as he took his place and called the room to order with a voice that carried the dry weight of authority. The proceedings began with the calling of Officer Tom Reynolds to the witness stand. He rose from his seat with a measured confidence, his tall frame and broad shoulders filling out his police uniform in a way that demanded attention. He strode to the stand with the ease of someone accustomed to being believed, pausing briefly to adjust his shirt before settling in. When he started to speak, his voice rolled out smoothly, recounting a version of events that painted a vivid picture. Several months prior, he claimed, he had stopped Jacob on the street for disturbing the peace. According to Reynolds, the encounter quickly spiraled out of control. Jacob had resisted, struck him, and then tried to flee. The story flowed effortlessly, each detail polished as if rehearsed, and the jury listened intently, their heads tilting in subtle nods of acknowledgement. Jacob remained still in his chair, his posture rigid, betraying none of the storm raging inside him. Every word from Reynolds cut like a blade, each one a distortion of the truth he knew so well. He remembered that evening with perfect clarity. He had been walking home after a long day, his mind on nothing more than the quiet of his apartment, when Reynolds had approached him without cause. The officer's demeanor had been hostile from the start, his words sharp and goading, as if daring Jacob to react. When no reaction came, Reynolds had fabricated a report to justify his actions. Jacob's hands clenched into fists beneath the table, the knuckles whitening, but his expression stayed calm, his eyes fixed forward. He waited, knowing his moment would come. The air in the courtroom grew heavier as Reynolds continued, his testimony weaving a narrative that seemed to settle comfortably into the minds of those listening. The journalists scribbled faster, their pencils scratching against paper, while the townsfolk exchanged glances, some nodding as if the officer's words confirmed suspicions they had harbored all along. The officers at the back stood with their arms crossed, their faces unreadable, but their presence a silent endorsement of their colleague. Judge Collins leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping lightly on the armrest, his gaze shifting between Reynolds and the jury, as if measuring the weight of the story being told. Reynolds leaned forward slightly as he spoke, his hands resting casually on the edge of the stand, his posture relaxed yet commanding. He described the alleged struggle in detail, how Jacob had pushed against him, how he had landed a blow to his shoulder, how he had taken off down the street before being subdued. The account was vivid, painting Jacob as volatile and reckless, a man who had lashed out without provocation. The jury's eyes followed Reynolds, their expressions a mix of concern and curiosity, as if trying to reconcile the man before them with the one sitting quietly at the defense table. Jacob's mind churned as he listened, replaying the real events of that night over and over. He had kept his hands at his sides, his voice steady, even as Reynolds had raised his own, stepping closer with every taunt. The street had been empty, the only witnesses the flickering streetlights and the occasional passing car, none of which had stopped. When it became clear Jacob wouldn't rise to the bait, Reynolds had turned away, his frustration palpable, only to later file a report that twisted the encounter into something unrecognizable. Jacob's jaw tightened, but he forced himself to breathe evenly, his gaze drifting to the folder of documents resting in front of Edward, his anchor in this sea of lies. The courtroom's high ceilings amplified the faint rustle of movement as Reynolds finished his testimony and settled back, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. He glanced toward Jacob for a brief moment, their eyes meeting across the room, and in that instant, Jacob saw the flicker of triumph in the officer's expression. It was the look of a man certain he had won, certain his words would carry the day. The jury shifted in their seats, some whispering to one another, while Edward scribbled notes furiously, his pen scratching against the page in a desperate attempt to keep up. Judge Collins raised a hand, silencing the room once more, his eyes narrowing as he prepared to move the proceedings forward. The light streaming through the courtroom windows had shifted, casting long shadows across the polished floor. The chandeliers above hummed faintly, their glow bathing the room in a warm, artificial light that contrasted with the cold tension filling the space. Jacob sat as still as ever, his hands now resting lightly on the table, his fingers brushing the edge of the leather folder. He knew the officer's story had landed, knew it had planted seeds of doubt in the minds of those watching, but he also knew he held the truth, a truth he had fought to preserve through every document, every sleepless night. The weight of the moment pressed down on him, but he bore it silently, waiting for the chance to unravel the lie that had brought him here. The tension in the courtroom thickened as Edward stood, his movements hesitant, his papers rustling faintly in his unsteady hands. He approached the witness stand where Reynolds sat, his questions tumbling out in a clumsy but earnest attempt to expose inconsistencies in the officer's story. Reynolds met each query with a steady gaze, his answers sharp and unwavering, occasionally punctuated by a slight smirk that rippled through the room like a pebble dropped in still water. The jury watched, their expressions unreadable, while the spectators shifted in their seats, the air growing taut with unspoken anticipation. Judge Collins tapped his pen against the table, a rhythmic sound that betrayed his growing impatience, his eyes narrowing as if he could already see the case sliding toward an inevitable conclusion. Then the moment shifted. The call came for Jacob to take the stand, and he rose from his seat with a slow, deliberate grace that seemed to pull the room's focus toward him. He walked to the witness stand, his steps measured, his military bearing evident in the straight line of his shoulders. The courtroom fell silent, the rustle of papers and the murmur of journalists fading into a hush as every eye followed him. Jacob placed his hand on the Bible, his fingers steady as he swore the oath, and for the first time that day, he turned his gaze directly toward Reynolds. A flicker of unease passed through the officer's eyes, a shadow that vanished as quickly as it appeared when he looked away. Jacob began to speak, his voice low and calm, yet laced with an undeniable strength that filled the space and held it captive. He laid out his account of that night, each word carefully chosen, peeling back the layers of Reynolds' narrative with precision. He described the encounter as it had truly unfolded, his walk home, the officer's unprovoked aggression, his own restraint in the face of provocation. The jury leaned forward slightly, their attention sharpening, while the journalists poised their pencils, sensing the tide beginning to turn. But the real shift came when Jacob reached into the leather folder he had carried with him and pulled out a set of documents. He presented them one by one, an identification card proving his rank as a captain in a U.S. Army Special Forces unit, followed by grainy but clear footage from a surveillance camera, painstakingly obtained by Edward after weeks of effort. The images showed Reynolds looming over him, his posture threatening, while Jacob stood still, his hands at his sides, unmoving. The room froze, the weight of the revelation settling over it like a heavy fog, and even Judge Collins leaned closer, his brows furrowing as he examined the papers passed to him. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the faint creak of the benches as spectators shifted, their breaths held. The documents circulated among the jury, their faces tightening with concentration as they studied the evidence. Reynolds sat stiffly at the plaintiff's table, his earlier confidence replaced by a subtle rigidity, his fingers gripping the edge of his chair. Edward watched from the defense table, his nervous energy giving way to a cautious hope, his eyes darting between Jacob and the jury. The journalists scribbled furiously now, their notes spilling across pages as they captured the moment that had turned the case on its head. The air in the room felt charged, electric with the realization that what had seemed a straightforward tale of guilt was unraveling before their eyes. Jacob remained at the stand, his posture unchanged, his hands resting lightly on the edge as he waited for the next step. He had spoken his truth, laid bare the facts he had guarded so carefully, and now the room seemed to pulse with the impact of his words. The surveillance footage, though silent, spoke louder than Reynolds's polished testimony, its grainy frames a stark contrast to the officer's vivid recounting. The jury passed the documents among themselves, their movements slow, deliberate, as if afraid to disturb the fragile shift in the atmosphere. Judge Collins adjusted his glasses, peering at the identification card with a scrutiny that suggested he was seeing Jacob for the first time, not as a defendant, but as something more. The chandeliers overhead cast their steady glow, illuminating the dust motes that drifted lazily through the air, a quiet counterpoint to the intensity below. The wooden floor gleamed under the light, its polish reflecting the shifting shadows of those seated along the benches. The officers at the back of the room stood a little straighter now, their arms still crossed but their faces betraying a hint of discomfort. The townsfolk watched with wide eyes, some leaning forward, others whispering to their neighbors in hushed tones that barely reached the front of the room. Jacob's presence at the stand anchored the scene, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the storm he had unleashed with those few pieces of paper. The moment stretched on, the courtroom suspended in a stillness that felt almost tangible. Jacob's gaze drifted briefly to the windows, where the afternoon sun filtered through, casting golden streaks across the walls. He knew the evidence he had presented was undeniable, a lifeline thrown into the chaos of accusation and doubt. The jury's hands lingered on the documents, their fingers tracing the edges as if testing their reality, while Reynolds shifted in his seat, his smirk long gone, replaced by a tightness around his mouth. Judge Collins set the papers down at last, his pen still in hand but motionless, his expression unreadable as he prepared to guide the proceedings forward. The turning point had arrived, and the room held its breath, waiting to see where it would lead. The stillness that gripped the courtroom after Jacob's testimony lingered like a heavy mist, unbroken until the rustle of movement stirred the air. The jurors exchanged fleeting glances, their eyes betraying a mix of surprise and contemplation, while the journalists bent over their notepads, their pencils racing to capture every detail of the shift that had just occurred. Reynolds sat at the plaintiff's table, his face drained of color, the once steady hands that had rested so confidently now fidgeting with the edge of the wooden surface before him. His composure had evaporated, leaving behind a man who seemed smaller, diminished by the weight of what had been revealed. Edward seized the moment, his earlier uncertainty replaced by a surge of determination as he rose and requested the court to call a witness. The shopkeeper whose camera had recorded the encounter. Judge Collins nodded in agreement, his expression stern but curious, and within half an hour, an elderly man named Marvin Clayton shuffled into the room. Marvin took the stand with the slow, careful steps of someone unaccustomed to such scrutiny, his weathered hands clasped loosely in front of him. He recounted what he had seen that night, his voice steady despite the faint tremor in his fingers, describing how Reynolds had acted with aggression, while Jacob had done nothing to invite conflict. His words aligned seamlessly with the footage Jacob had presented, each sentence bolstering the defense like bricks laid in a growing wall. The cameras had captured the truth, untainted by embellishment, and Marvin's testimony cemented it further, his simple honesty cutting through the haze of doubt that had clouded the room. Reynolds shifted in his seat, his shoulders hunching as he attempted to interject, but his voice faltered, thin and unsteady, his arguments crumbling under their own weight. Judge Collins raised a hand, his sharp gesture silencing the officer mid-sentence, his face a mask of impatience as he restored order. By then, the case had begun to unravel, its threads slipping loose with every passing minute. Jacob's reputation as a soldier with an impeccable record stood in stark contrast to the shaky foundation of Reynolds' accusations, a disparity that grew more glaring as the evidence mounted. The jurors leaned toward one another, their whispers a soft undercurrent in the room, while the spectators along the benches stirred, their hushed conversations rippling through the crowd like waves lapping at a shore. The tension swelled to its peak, a palpable force that pressed against the walls, and Judge Collins called for a recess, his voice cutting through the murmurs as he instructed both sides to prepare their final arguments. Jacob returned to his seat beside Edward, the burden that had weighed on him since the ordeal began easing slightly, a quiet relief settling into his bones as he felt the tide turning in his favor. The courtroom emptied slowly, the spectators filing out into the corridors, their footsteps echoing against the hardwood floors as they dispersed. Jacob remained where he was for a moment, his hands resting on the table, his gaze drifting to the documents that had shifted the day's momentum. The leather folder lay open, its contents now familiar to the jury, his military credentials, the surveillance stills, each piece a testament to the life he had fought to protect. Edward sat beside him, flipping through his notes with renewed focus, his earlier nervousness replaced by a cautious optimism that flickered in his eyes. Across the room, Reynolds lingered at his table, his head bowed slightly, his fingers still tracing the edge of the wood, as if searching for something to hold on to. The windows of the courtroom framed a sky tinged with the hues of late afternoon, the light softening as it spilled across the floor, casting long shadows that stretched toward the benches. The chandeliers above dimmed slightly, their hum a faint backdrop to the stillness that had returned once the crowd thinned. Marvin Clayton had left the stand, his role fulfilled, his figure disappearing through the double doors with the same unhurried gait that had brought him in. The officers who had stood at the back earlier now hovered near the exit, their postures less rigid, their presence less certain. The truth had begun to surface, rising steadily like water breaching a dam, and with it came a shift that no one in the room could ignore. Jacob exhaled slowly, his breath steadying as he sat back in his chair, the wooden frame creaking faintly under his weight. The recess stretched out before him, a brief pause in the storm, but he knew the final battle still loomed ahead. The jurors had retreated to their chamber, their faces etched with the weight of what they had heard and seen, their deliberations already beginning to take shape in the quiet of their minds. Reynolds remained a solitary figure across the room, his earlier bravado stripped away, leaving behind a man grappling with the consequences of his own words. Judge Collins had left the bench, his robes trailing behind him as he exited, the sound of his footsteps fading into the distance. The air in the courtroom carried a new weight now, one born of clarity rather than doubt. Jacob felt it settle around him, a quiet assurance that the truth he had clung to was finally breaking free. The documents on the table gleamed under the light, their edges worn from handling, their contents unshakable. He traced a finger along the folder's spine, a small gesture that grounded him as he waited for the next phase. The recess would end soon, and with it would come the closing arguments, the jury's verdict, the resolution he had fought for. For now he sat in the stillness, the pressure lifting from his shoulders, the path ahead growing clearer with every moment that passed. The recess ended with the sharp sound of the gavel as Judge Collins reclaimed his seat, his stern gaze sweeping the room to silence the murmurs that had spilled into the corridors. Edward rose to deliver his closing argument, his posture straighter than it had been at the trial's start, his voice carrying a newfound strength that resonated through the courtroom. He spoke of Jacob as a man of honor, a soldier whose life had been unjustly jeopardized by fabricated charges. He pointed to the evidence, the surveillance footage, Marvin Clayton's testimony, and the glaring inconsistencies in Reynolds' account, each word building a case that seemed to solidify in the air before the jury. The spectators sat riveted, their breaths shallow, their eyes locked on Edward as he wove the threads of truth into a tapestry too clear to ignore. The prosecutor took his turn next, his voice steady but lacking the conviction it had held earlier. He grasped at procedural details and minor discrepancies, attempting to shore up a narrative that had already begun to collapse under its own weight. His arguments fell flat, unable to counter the momentum that had shifted so decisively toward the defense. Reynolds sat at his table, his head bowed, his hands clasped tightly in his lap as he avoided the eyes of those around him. The jurors watched with expressions that betrayed their leanings, their faces set in lines of quiet resolve. When Judge Collins handed the case over to them, a thick silence descended, broken only by the faint creak of the benches as the crowd adjusted, waiting. Jacob turned his gaze to the window, where the sun dipped low on the horizon, painting the sky in deep shades of crimson and gold, the fading light a mirror to the day's waning tension. The jury deliberated for an hour, their absence stretching the nerves of everyone left in the courtroom. The spectators fidgeted, some whispering predictions, others staring ahead in restless anticipation. Edward sat beside Jacob, flipping through his notes one last time, though his hands were steady now, his earlier anxiety replaced by a quiet confidence. Reynolds remained slumped, his shoulders hunched, as if bracing for a blow he knew was coming. The officers who had lingered throughout the trial stood near the back, their presence less imposing, their faces unreadable, but their postures betraying a subtle unease. When the jury filed back into the room, the air tightened once more, every sound amplified. The shuffle of feet, the rustle of clothing, the soft thud of the door closing behind them. The forewoman, a middle-aged woman with a weary face and graying hair pulled into a tight bun, stepped forward to deliver the verdict. Her hands trembled slightly as she unfolded the paper, but her voice held firm as she announced, "Not guilty." The courtroom erupted in a wave of whispers and muffled exclamations, the sound swelling like a tide against the walls. Reynolds shot to his feet, his mouth opening as if to protest, his face flushed with a mix of anger and disbelief. But Judge Collins brought the gavel down with a resounding crack, his glare silencing the officer before he could utter a word. Order returned swiftly, the crowd settling under the judge's command, though the undercurrent of reaction lingered in their shifting glances and stifled breaths. Jacob closed his eyes for a brief moment, letting the weight of the words wash over him. Relief flooded his chest, a slow, warm tide that loosened the knots that had bound him for months. He opened his eyes again, his vision clearing as he took in the room. The jurors returning to their seats, their duty fulfilled. Edward beside him, a faint smile tugging at his lips. The journalists, scribbling their final notes, their pages filled. With the story of his vindication, Reynolds sank back into his chair, his hands covering his face for a moment before dropping to his sides, defeated. The officers at the back exchanged looks, their camaraderie with their colleague now strained by the outcome they hadn't anticipated. The sunlight outside had dimmed further, the sky a deepening red as the day slipped toward evening. Inside, the chandeliers cast their steady glow, illuminating the faces of those who had witnessed the trial's end. The wooden benches, worn smooth by years of use, creaked as the spectators began to rise, some lingering to watch Jacob, others heading for the exits with hurried steps. Judge Collins gathered his papers, his movements brisk as he prepared to close the session, his expression softened by the faintest hint of satisfaction. The gavel struck once more, a final punctuation to the proceedings, and the room began to empty, the tension that had held it together dissolving into the hum of departing footsteps. Jacob remained seated for a moment longer, his hands resting on the table where his leather folder still lay, its contents no longer a shield but a victory. He traced the edge of the folder with his thumb, the leather cool against his skin, grounding him in the reality of what had just transpired. Edward packed his briefcase beside him, the clatter of pens and papers a quiet counterpoint to the fading noise of the crowd. The truth had prevailed, striking its final blow against the lies that had sought to bury it, and Jacob felt the weight of that victory settle into him, solid and unshakable. He rose at last, his uniform crisp despite the long day, and stepped toward the door, the courtroom behind him now a memory of a battle fought and won. Jacob stepped out of the courthouse as twilight settled over the town, the sky a soft gradient of purple and gray. The streets stretched out quietly before him, disturbed only by the occasional hum of a passing car, their headlights cutting through the gathering dusk. Edward walked beside him, his grin broader than Jacob had ever seen, a lightness in his step that hadn't been there before. He clapped Jacob on the shoulder, his gesture warm with the unspoken triumph they both felt. Jacob returned a nod, his lips curving faintly, though his mind drifted elsewhere. He replayed the months that had led to this moment, the razor-thin edge he had walked, where a single lie had nearly stripped him of everything he had built. The next morning dawned with the rustle of newspapers landing on doorsteps across the town. Headlines blazed across the front pages, recounting the trial in bold print, each article framing Jacob's story as a testament to the fight for justice. His name emerged as a quiet beacon, while Reynolds became a cautionary tale, a shadow cast over those who believed the truth could be buried beneath bravado and fabrication. The townsfolk read the stories over their coffee, some nodding in approval, others shaking their heads at the unraveling of a man they had once trusted. Jacob, meanwhile, slipped back into the rhythm of his routine, the familiar weight of his uniform settling over his shoulders as he moved through his days. Yet something within him had shifted, a subtle sharpening of his senses, an awareness of the small details, the creak of a floorboard, the flicker of a streetlight, that he had once overlooked. He found himself standing at the window of his apartment one early morning, the glass cool against his fingertips as he gazed out at the waking world. The first rays of sunlight crept over the horizon, painting the rooftops in hues of gold and pink, the town stirring slowly beneath the dawn. Birds called faintly from the trees lining the street, their songs weaving into the distant sound of a delivery truck rumbling past. Jacob watched it all, his breath steady, the storm that had raged around him now reduced to a memory. The battle was over, its echoes fading into the normalcy of this new day, but he knew the world beyond his window held countless others whose struggles still waited in the shadows, their truths yet to surface. The apartment behind him was quiet, the furniture worn but familiar, each piece a marker of the life he had reclaimed. His boots stood polished by the door, their laces neatly tied, a silent promise of readiness. He reached up to adjust the collar of his uniform, the fabric crisp against his skin, the gesture a small ritual that anchored him to the present. The town outside continued its slow awakening. Curtains parted in neighboring windows, a dog barked in the distance. The scent of fresh bread drifted from the bakery down the street. Jacob took it all in, his eyes tracing the familiar lines of the place he called home, a place that felt both unchanged and entirely new. Edward had stopped by the previous evening, his briefcase tucked under his arm, his face still alight with the glow of their victory. They had shared a drink on the narrow balcony, the clink of glasses a quiet celebration against the backdrop of a starless sky. Now, alone again, Jacob felt the weight of that moment linger, a reminder of the partnership that had carried him through. The newspapers lay folded on his kitchen table, their ink smudged from handling, their words a public record of the ordeal he had endured. He had skimmed them earlier, not for validation, but for closure, before setting them aside to face the day ahead. The horizon glowed brighter now, the sun climbing higher, its light spilling across the fields that stretched beyond the town's edge. Jacob's gaze lingered there, where the land met the sky, a vast expanse that seemed to hold both promise and uncertainty. He knew his fight had ended, its resolution etched into the pages of those papers, into the minds of those who had watched it unfold. But he also knew that somewhere out there, beyond the reach of his quiet victory, others stood on the precipice of their own battles, their voices still unheard, their stories untold. The thought settled into him, not as a burden, but as a quiet truth, a recognition of the world's endless cycles of struggle and redemption. He turned from the window at last, the floorboards creaking under his weight as he crossed the room. His hand brushed the back of a chair, its wood smooth from years of use, and he paused to glance at the small photograph on the shelf, a younger version of himself in uniform, standing beside comrades whose faces he still carried in memory. The image grounded him, a tether to the man he had been before the trial, before the lie that had threatened to undo him. He straightened, his shoulders squared, and stepped toward the door, the faint jingle of his keys in his pocket a signal of motion, of purpose. The dawn had fully broken now, the town alive with the hum of morning, and Jacob walked into it, ready for whatever lay ahead, the storm behind him a fading whisper on the wind. Thanks for watching all the way through. If you found this story interesting, feel free to leave a like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one.